the media and as different media outlets have different biases and how we can spot them. So just before we begin, I just want to mention a few things to keep in mind for the session. Of course, everything we say in the session will stay in the session, so don't worry about what you will share in the session. It won't be shared anywhere else without your consent. Then, of course, this is a safe space, so we are adopting a non-judgmental approach, so you're more than free to express your opinions freely. Of course, you have a right to pass if you don't want to participate, or if you don't want to say anything, that's perfectly fine. Also, we also have a rule of make no assumptions about other people, and always try to be respectful and listen to their opinions and what they have to say. Of course, you're more than welcome, and you can disagree with other people, but always in a respectful and non-offensive manner. And as I was mentioning before, please do ask questions and participate if you want. You're more than welcome to do so. And at the end of the session, we also have a few websites to direct you if you need help and advice during this lockdown period. Lauren, can you move to the next slide, please? Thank you. So as I mentioned before, this session is called Spot Bias. And yeah. So I have a first question to start off on slide number 4, which says, yeah, Lauren, can you move to slide number 4, please? Thank you. Sorry. Which says, rock is the best new birth, says Rock. So last week we discussed about fake news. Do you think this sentence could be qualified as fake news? And if yes, why? And if not, why not? You can either write into the chat or raise your hand if you want to say something. So would you say this sentence is fake news or not? Constantine says, I think it's just an opinion. I think I see some people nodding. Yeah. I see Ivy says fake because he's a rock artist, so he's probably going to say what he does. That's a good point. So you think it's fake news? All right. Andy says, I think it is not, as it's their opinion. All right, let's go on to the next slide. So this isn't fake news. This is what we call bias writing. And bias writing occurs when a writer shows favoritism or prejudice towards a particular opinion instead of being fair and balanced. And this is usually used to push people towards a particular point of view. Why do you think there is always a clear difference between fake news and biased writing? And how can we make the difference between the two? You remember the definition of that, if you attended last week's definition of fake news? So last week we were saying that fake news are stories that are entirely made up, while biased writing is writing that is based on a real story or a topic, but that is not presented in an objective way. I see Dominic saying bias is one side and fake news is completely untrue. I think that's a very good summary. Gracie says, well, let's say if it is news for a rock magazine, but if it was the Times, it would be fake. Yeah, that's a good point. Lida says the difference is that one is completely made up and biased writing is an actual opinion. Yeah, I think most of you have spotted the difference there. In that fake news is completely untrue, while biased writing is at least based partly on reality. And then, of course, the tricky part becomes who decides what is completely untrue or not. And that's where it gets a bit tricky, I think. Constantine says, bias is not meant to harm anyone. That's an interesting point. Do you think fake news is always meant to harm someone? Maybe. Or maybe to sway their opinion towards something. And Constantine says that it's made for someone's personal gain. Many times it is. That's a good point. And bias doesn't happen for personal gain. And Lida said the bias can harm people if it is a harmful opinion about someone, definitely. If you present something in a way that is not accurate and that is harmful towards someone, that can definitely can have a negative effect on the person. So bias as well can be harmful to other people. So thank you very much. Can we move on to the next slide? Thank you. So there are different types of biases. There's what we call positive bias, which is exaggerated praise for the thing being written about. So the example we saw about rock is probably a positive bias because it said that rock was the best music in the world. And then we have the opposite, of course, which is negative bias, which, as some of you mentioned, can be harmful to people, which usually consists of attacking the subject matter and highlighting the reasons why is it bad in a non-objective way. And then we have the balanced or neutral perspective, which is the opposite of bias. And this type of writing doesn't include an opinion, but is instead neutral and factual. Do you think it is possible to be completely neutral and factual about everything? Or are there some things in which it's impossible or just very hard to be neutral about? Can you think maybe of a news story that you read that you think is very difficult to be neutral about? All right, I think we'll see some examples now in the next slides. So if we could move on to the next slide. I see Adam writing, if you have long-held opinions or they affect the views of society. Yes, I think that's a good point. If you're completely neutral, then you would just say facts, which would not make a very interesting news article. I think this raises an important point because you are saying that presenting news in a certain way also is done for business. so to sell more papers, as you just written. And you say that it is hard to be neutral about bad things that have happened in the past, for example, the Holocaust. Of course, I think that's a good example. I agree that it's hard to be neutral about it. And Gracie says, in activism, it's very hard to be neutral. For example, I'm home educated and therefore I am biased against anyone who thinks home education is bad, that is good for me and bad for them. And that's, yeah, I think we'll talk about it more later, that being neutral doesn't always mean being in the middle of something. So when you have two extremes, the truth might not always be to take a little bit of the two extremes and then be in the middle. Sometimes being balanced means going to one of the two extremes, as we'll see later with the case of climate change, for example. I see Lila saying she's home educated too, which is great. Okay, so let's look at the slide, which is news headlines by the Sun, a UK newspaper, which most of you know, I think, which says believe in Britain with a word game with the word leave, referring to Brexit. Would you say this is a neutral headline? Is it a biased news headline, or is it fake news? What would you say it is? You can write in the chat maybe, and then we can discuss about it. You can see Gracie saying it's definitely biased. Andy says that this is a bias as it is heavily leaning on one side of the argument. Ivy says it's biased as well. Yes, so for now everyone said biased. And Constantine writes, it's telling you to vote leave. Definitely, I think we can agree on that. Lida says bias. Anne says that it's clearly an opinion, that it's not news. So I think we all agree that this headline is a biased headline because it's clearly indicating, at least it's clearly leaning towards one side of the Brexit debate, and it's supporting leave. And why do you think it's not fake news though? Why would you say it's biased but not completely fake, as some other headlines might be? Dominic writes, because some people wanted Brexit. Yes, that's true. Lida says it's not fake because Brexit is not made up. So it's a very good point, as we mentioned before, it's based on a real story or something that really happened. Andy Daniel says, because there was an option to vote leave. That's true. And Gracie says, because it's true for some people. I think that's a good point. So I think I agree with you in the sense that this is a biased opinion, and that for all the reasons that you mentioned. And of course, there's no right or wrong answers. right or wrong answer, it's sometimes tricky to assess whether something is biased writing or maybe it goes a bit too far and it becomes fake news. So it's always sometimes it's a bit difficult to assess. Let's move on to the next example from the New York Times, and it's a headline from 1969 or 8, I don't remember the exact year, but which says, "Men walk on the moon, astronauts land on plane, collect rocks, plant flag." So what do you think this headline is biased, or do you think it's objective, or do you think maybe it's fake news? Who knows? Dominic says that it isn't biased because it's true. Lida says it's true as well. Constantine as well says it's true. Adam says it's very objective. And Ivy says it's happened. It's not taking a side, so it's just presenting what happened. Gracie said, "I think it's true, but some people think it was made up." Indeed, some people think it's not true. And Andy says, "This is completely true and just states facts." So as many of you mentioned, I also think this is quite an objective, actually a very objective headline. Also because, as Anne just has written, it doesn't use any emotive language. It just states what happened in a very factual way without expressing any opinion. And also the language, it doesn't use any adjectives. For example, it could have said, "Men, extraordinary thing happened, men walk on the moon." That would have been already a bit more biased, but here it just states very plainly what happened. Gracie said, and it does not say that they were amazing. They just said it happened. Very good point. Yeah. And I think on something like this, it's easier to have an objective headline than on a topic like Brexit, which is more divisive. But thank you for participating, and let's move on to the next headline. So this is a headline from the Daily Express, which says, "Snow chaos," and then underneath it says, "and they still claim it's global warming." So this is referring to a snowstorm, I assume, or a day in which it was snowing a lot. And underneath it's saying, "and they still claim it's global warming," implying that because it's snowing, then global warming must be must be fake or must be irrelevant or something. I don't know what they're implying exactly. What do you think about this headline? Do you think it looks objective, or do you think it looks very biased or maybe fake? Ivy says it says chaos, so they're saying it's bad. Indeed, so they are judging what the actual event, so they are already taking a side. Adam says half and half, using facts to support bias. Indeed. Thomas says bias but not fake, they just state their opinion on a snowstorm. And Dominic says just because it's snowing doesn't mean there is no global warming. Yes, indeed. And Gracie says just because it snows does not mean global warming does not exist, just as Dominic said. So yeah, I think we agree that it is a biased headline. And Lida says it's biased because global warming still exists. So basically, they have taken a side, and they are claiming that global warming does not exist because it was snowing. Konstantin says there is global warming, yet there is snow in the poles. How? Does someone want to answer that? To explain? Why do you think it can snow and there could be global warming at the same time? I guess because global warming is a more long-term process. So even if sometimes it can snow in a part of the world, it doesn't mean that overall oh, you're being sarcastic. Sorry. Thanks for pointing that out. Just making sure that we are on the same page. All right. It happens because the sun is melting ice. Okay. So let's move on to the next slide. Yeah. Which is about the middle ground fallacy, which is what I was referring to before. So the middle ground fallacy says that the middle ground between two extremes is correct just because it is the middle ground. So let's look at the example because it's easier to have a practical example. So let's imagine that person A says that climate change is not real and we shouldn't do anything about it. And let's say that person B replies and says that climate change is an emergency and we should take immediate radical measures to tackle it. So from a logical point of view, the middle ground would be that climate change is somewhat of a problem and that we should take some step to address it in the future. So that would be the more reasonable middle ground between these three statements. Does that mean that the middle ground is the most accurate statements between the three sentences? Or do you think there is another, for example, that person A or person B is more correct? So Konstantin says that, take an example, if you want to know what 2 + 2 is, and one person says 2 while the other says 4, it doesn't mean the answer is 3. That's another way of putting it, and that's another good example. Ivy says, not necessarily. Lida says that the middle ground in this example would be the right statement around 30 years ago, probably when the scientific consensus around climate change was not as strong as it is today. That's probably a good point. Andy says that it all depends on what the two opinions are. Definitely. And in this case, what do you think is the most accurate opinion? The one that is more closest to reality, let's say. Gracie says, well, sometimes it is hard to identify bias because you could be biased but not know it. That's a very good point. But the tricky thing about bias, and we're going to discuss this in a bit, is that it's conscious but can also be unconscious, so that we might not be aware of the fact that we are biased. So we just assume that the way we see things is objective, but in reality we have bias for many different reasons, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. But that's a very good point. Anne says, and a lot longer ago. And Adam says, it's better to reach consensus than act on that rather than take the middle. I think it's definitely safer given the risks that climate change poses. And act, possibly, yeah. Good point. So yeah, always keep this in mind, and that the middle ground is not always the best way to decide whether something is true or not between two very opposite opinions. Ivy says, I think that right now the most accurate statement would be B. And Lida says that in some situations, like Brexit, for example, there is no middle. And Gracie says, yes, but they are panicking. This is bad. Dominic says middle ground because we've got coronavirus to deal with. I think, yeah, the fact that we have coronavirus certainly isn't making things easier, but hopefully you can tackle the two things at the same time. Also given that they are quite linked in some ways. Adam asks, what is the best way to tackle middle ground fallacy? Does anyone have an idea on what's the best way to tackle it? I think a good way is to do what we always should do when we read the news, which is double check information and read different news sources. So there's no, at least I don't really have a secret thing in which we can not fall into the trap of middle ground fallacy.
I think a bit like Anne says, you can use the example if you know what the answer is to try to persuade people, but as you kind of say, Adam, maybe the middle ground is better in some situations than nothing, or than doing nothing in this example about climate change.
I guess it's really hard because hard to focus on these things because of the coronavirus thing, but it's still important that you notice and talk about and try and bring it to light about the climate change and things like that. We shouldn't let it get in the way.
Yeah. I think we should try and address different problems at the same time. I think it's also important to see how these problems are connected with one another. So when we address one problem, we're also addressing other problems at the same time. Yeah, that's a good point. Thank you. Can we move to the next slide? Thank you. So now the final questions to end the session. Just some few questions to discuss. How often do you read or hear biased things? And what do you think are some different reasons for using bias? And what impact could biased writing have on the person or community who reads it? So maybe you can start with the first question. How often do you read or hear biased things? Would you say that the news that you read every day are mostly biased or mostly objective, more or less? Adam says, my Twitter bubble is very biased. Yeah, I think Twitter is a very good place to find biased opinions, definitely. Gracie says that I don't read news. Okay, well, that's a good way not to hear biased things, I guess. Dominic says a lot because talking about football with my friend can get very heated. Yeah, I think when it comes to sports, people tend to be very biased because they support a team, and emotions get in the way, so it's difficult to be rational about things. But luckily, supporting a team does not harm anyone, so in that case, it's not very consequential. Ivy says you will hear bias all the time in everyday life. For example, if you went to a restaurant and you say, "Wow, that was the best food I've ever tasted," or something, that would be a biased opinion. Yeah. Lida says that lots of newspapers have a very strong view and bias. And Adam says that sports can be an acceptable way to express bias. I think, yeah, I agree with that. As long as it remains respectful of other biases. And Ivy says, though it is not very important. Dominic mentions the rivalry between Celtic and the Rangers, Scotland. And why do you think, let's talk about, for example, different newspapers that you might know. Why do you think some newspapers have different biases or leanings? What are the reasons behind those biases? Maybe because they're trying to promote a certain political view, or because they are funded, for example, by different companies or other people who want to promote a certain view. And says financial interests of the owners. Yes, I think that's one of the major reasons behind the bias of many newspapers. Lida says because sometimes just the facts can be a bit boring, and this joins what Adam said before, that some newspapers just have to present things to sell more newspapers. Gracie says because they have different people writing them, and therefore they could just have different opinions. Of course, the individual journalists as well, their individual bias can also be a reason why some articles are biased. And Dominic says because they say that it's having an issue because they say that they're the best city in the country and they've got the best sports team, etc. So again, in sports, yeah, there's always bias in sports commentary. Definitely. Let's move to the next slide to see about our own biases. So what are some of our own biases, and where do you think biases come from? So basically the question is, why do we think what we think, basically? Why do we have certain biases? Why do we interpret things in a certain way? Adam says society and upbringing, definitely. So culture, if we can summarize it, maybe. Yeah. Ivy says that if you feel strongly about something, it can seem normal to be biased. Yes, so if it's something that directly affects you, then maybe you would feel more strongly about it. That's a good point. And it says that bias can come from our first impression of things. That's an interesting point, and that's true, I think. And Dominic says that Liverpool is the best team. And Lida says, I don't think how bad the climate emergency is my own bias, because it isn't just an opinion, it's scientific facts. And yeah, I think that joins what we were saying before, that in this case, even if it might seem a biased thing to say that climate change is an emergency, at the end of the day, we have to see if it's grounded in facts and evidence. And if it is, then it might be something that is not as biased to say. Gracie said, like I said earlier about being home educated, I'm being biased because I am part of a group that people don't like. So that, yeah, I think, as we were saying before, if it's something that that you are personally affected by or that you feel strongly about, then you might feel strongly about it. And yeah, that Andy says that I am biased against the Percy Jackson films because I read the books first. That's a good example, as Adam said. So yeah, so bias can come from a society, culture, upbringing, our own personal experiences, things that personally affect us during our everyday life. Do you think it is possible to find someone without any bias? Or do we all have biases? Adam says we all have bias. Gracie says that we all have bias as well. And I think I agree with you in the sense that biases can also be unconscious. So whether we want or like to be as unbiased as we can, we all have things in our minds that we are not aware of and that influence the way we perceive things. And Andy says, I think we have biases because otherwise we would just be fact machines. Indeed. And let's move to the final slide to see how we can, and just to summarize some of the points that we mentioned. So how can we spot biases and read information, being able to identify different biases? So the first point I wrote down is that it's important to always be open-minded and ready to change our minds. So if we have a strong opinion about something and we read something that is supported by evidence, even if it's not always easy, it's always good to be ready to change our minds about something. The second thing I wrote down is that it's important to always question and be critical of what we read, even if it's something we have a bias in favor of. It might be a newspaper that we particularly like or a writer that we particularly appreciate. It's always important to still be critical and question what he or she is saying. Then I wrote to read different news sources to get a full picture. So of course, an event can be interpreted in different ways by different people. So it's important to read different newspapers to see what different people are saying and what different journalists or witnesses have seen or interpreted to get the full picture. Gracie says, but I can't change my mind about whether me and my friends are wrong because it works for me, even though other people think it's wrong. I guess it depends what you are talking about. It's difficult for me to say, but I think you still made a good point because when you are in a group, especially, it's even more difficult to change your mind because opinions are reinforced because people share things and hear the same opinion from a group of friends, for example, and it can be even more difficult to change opinion. And then the fourth point I wrote down is to decide what sources of information are more reliable. So at the beginning it might be a bit tricky, but after a while, when we read different newspapers or different news sources, we might see that some newspapers are more objective or have news that are more interesting or that are presented in a better way, and so we might rely on them more rather than other news sources. Lida said it can also be hard to have a different opinion to your community. Definitely, and sometimes when you express an opinion that is very different from maybe your family or your community, you might be maybe excluded or stigmatized for it. I agree with this point. It can be quite difficult to have a different opinion and also express it, especially in some societies around the world. So very good point there. Thank you. Then I wrote down to double check the information you read. So if you read something from one source that may sound a bit unusual or surprising, it's always a good idea to check from another source whether that is confirmed or not. Constantine says that if you're surrounded by bias, it is hard not to be manipulated by it. That is true, and that joins what Adam was saying before, that it's also we have biases all our lives in our upbringing and society. So at some points they become very ingrained in our minds, and at a point where we're not even aware that we have them anymore. And the last point I wrote is that when we read something, of course, it's useful to think about biases that the writer or the journalist might have, as every writer has bias and every person has biases, as we have established. So this was the end of the session. Do you have any comment or something that you want to share, or any question before we end? Thank you very much for participating. These are some websites if you need support or advice during the lockdown for young people. So yeah, don't hesitate to check them out and have a look if you feel like you need to or you want to. Lida says that it's hard to notice what you think is a bias and not just true when so many people think the same thing. Thank you, Adam. Adam said thanks so much. So thank you for participating. And yeah, Lauren, do you want to say maybe a few final words?
Those people who haven't been to our new website, then they can check it out. It's www.dreambigathome.uk. And if and you can. It'd be really great if you can donate to our appeal, or pass it on to your friends as well, and also check out all of our really great activities that we have there as well. But thanks all for coming, and same time again next week for our next social action session. Tomorrow we have a Elfin and Pioneer Games, and at the weekend we've got the big camp in. So check your email, social media, and the website for all of the information for those things. Thanks everyone.
Thank you very much.